Yes. Okay. Wonderful. This is so nice. I've really been looking forward to having this conversation with you for a while, Stuart. So I don't know if you've seen any of the other interviews that I've done, of like the Reed and Pamela Mang, and the recent one I uploaded was John Fullerton just a couple of days ago. I really enjoy, because so much of working regeneratively is also paying attention to one's own inner story and how we react to how we interact with the world out there, and how we challenge ourselves in our own frames and develop our own cosmovision as we move along. And I know that I've been inspired by your work for a very long time. Like when we met here on Mallorca, I mentioned this to you, that your work with Sim Van Der Ryn in this little book, Ecological Design, has been giving me some of the key pieces that I've been building a theoretical framework of for the last 20 years. And so the scale linking design bit in particular. But I would love for you to just start with telling a little bit your story, because I know that you've had this amazing opportunity to not just work with elders like Sim, but also you spend all this time with Christopher Alexander, and now you get to work closely with John Fullerton. And so, yeah, how did you get to where you are now?
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Very gracious introduction. I grew up on Vancouver Island, which is a magnificent part of the coastal temperate rainforest that stretches all the way from Northern California all the way up to Alaska. And my island was in the midst of this biocultural diversity that's just extraordinary. Ancient forests that store more carbon than really any other ecosystems on the entire planet, and therefore probably have the greatest cognitive capacity, more cells firing with all of that living, active matter. And so I grew up with this paradox of these magnificent ecosystems, beautiful fjords, mountains, grizzlies, right across the Georgia Strait. I felt that so profoundly. And then when we went on family trips, we'd go past these massive, lunar scale clear cuts. And I just had this sense, how can we be extracting so much? And in my youth, I saw the forest depleted. I saw this massive pulp mill that was the lifeline of my town actually shut down, deconstructed, and literally shipped off to China because too many trees had been cut. The industry couldn't be sustained. The fish, salmon, halibut, caught, fished out. The mines, actually worked out within a few decades. And so when I go back to my hometown, it's unrecognizable. Everything has been extracted. A lot of it is regenerating and bouncing back, but it just led me on the path, growing up at sort of the edge of this massive extractive economy, even in Canada, even in British Columbia. Growing up, I just had this sense I wanted to connect with the patterns of life, with living systems, the dynamics of nature. And that led me to this nascent field of complex living systems. And it was an incredibly exciting time. I made my way to Berkeley for my PhD, and it was at a time when chaos theory was just being developed by Steve Smale right down the hall. Strange attractors, fractal geometry, nonlinear dynamics, and really in an interdisciplinary way. So in Berkeley, I was connecting, the deep mathematics around this to practical physics, chemistry, biology, economics, sociology, cross-cutting. What could complex systems...
Your PhD is in mathematics, no?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So I did my doctorate at Berkeley in applied mathematics, but really my focus was in ecological economics, which was just emerging at that time. Extraordinary man, Richard Norgaard, really is the co-founder of the entire field of ecological economics alongside Robert Costanza. Mm-hmm. And Norgaard continues to emphasize a deep qualitative systems approach. Which kind of complements where the hard-edged analytic side of ecological economics is gone, and pricing nature, which maybe is a misstep, You know, and it was fascinating. I mean, as I rewind and think about early 90s leading up to the Rio Summit, thinking about the contested foundations of ecological economics, a lot of what we're still trying to work through was right there, you know, with someone like Norgaard emphasizing profound questioning of worldviews, epistemologies, really trying to reinvent economics at a deep, deep ground. And then Costanza making really important technical contributions that could immediately help us shift markets, but maybe have some unintended consequences.
Well,
So
just briefly, let me go into it briefly, because it's such an important bit, because it is actually what you're sort of turning the contrast up on is how back then this dilemma that we're in of, on the one hand, yeah, we need quantitative information, and mathematics is super useful, and that kind of analytical way of seeing is enormously powerful. But how so often we then, because it also slots into the systems we've built, and is more action oriented in them, we dismiss the qualitative aspects and the patterns and the stuff that you like. Please continue, that you studied with Sim
well, exactly. You know, the ways of being, you know, cognition at a very deep level, our social matrix, these deep, deep foundations of what it means to be human. So I emerged from graduate school in 1992, literally just as the Rio Summit was happening, and was on a path to say, could we take this nascent field of ecological economics, this nascent field of complex living systems, could we apply it in the world? What would that mean? Ecologists even then were saying, and you've noticed this too, Daniel, ecologists were saying, the ecosystems we love are falling apart. How can I be a neutral scientist? In every field, anthropologists were realizing these cultures, I'm quote, studying from the outside, are under such attack from a certain Western epistemology, they can't survive. I need to become an activist anthropologist. And so in field after field, there was that ferment at Berkeley, you know, around the world in the early 90s, saying we need new ways of being, new ways of honoring each other's worlds, a world that holds many worlds. And so from the early 90s, I've been trying to understand, you know, this cognitive diversity that it's so powerful, linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. You map that against biological diversity, it's a beautiful correlation. It is highest at the equator and then moves very smoothly as you head to the North Pole or to the South Pole, decrease in biocultural diversity. We don't fully understand why, but we do know there's this profound correlation. Wherever there's the plant diversity, the ecological diversity, there's greater linguistic cultural diversity. If that's the true wealth of the planet, which I would argue, and we could say if we go back 12,000 years, that's probably when it peaked, when we had the greatest biocultural diversity, the greatest deep adaptation of human cultures and ecosystems, and the greatest flourishing of languages and local autonomous systems. We kind of have been through these ages of empire and sort of these cognitive empires, these ways of ordering and structuring knowledge and communication. So from the beginning, I've been thinking about this deep weave of how can we have these living systems emerge gracefully in a profoundly place-based way. And that led me to write a book called Ecological Design with the extraordinary man, Sim Van Der Ryn, who was a professor at Berkeley. So I kind of got to do a second PhD. It was just lovely. I got to spend another 3 years doing this deep dive with Sim, exploring a living systems perspective for the built environment, for landscapes, for products, infrastructure. What would that deep weave look like?
Was that under a research fellowship at Berkeley, or who financed those 2 years?
Actually, it was supported by Sim's nonprofit, which was known as the Farallons Institute in those days. So we literally got modest grant support to do this research project. And it was a serious, long-term collaboration, just really, really extraordinary. And in those days, I was working closely with Christopher Alexander as well, who is a legendary architect, planner, spent decades at Berkeley, and wrote these beautiful books, Pattern Language, and then The Nature of Order, which I was able to support him on.
Yeah, you've helped him curate those, no? Like, how did
Yeah.
that work? Like, how did you work together?
Well,
because they're amazing.
Yeah. The Nature of Order, everyone must read. It's 4 volumes. It's 1,500 pages.
Yeah, everybody who can afford to take a sabbatical of a year to really
exactly
sit with it. Yeah.
So Chris was really looking at the foundations of the living world, and he called it the structure of wholeness. That how do you actually look at these deep relationships, the flows of water, the plants, the trees, the people, every part of the built environment, every piece of furniture in a nested scale linking way, from how do you think about the design of a room, to the house, to the street that it's on, to the open spaces, to urban design, to regional planning, and now we'd probably extend it right to biosphere design. But Chris was trained as a mathematician, like me, and we both have wandered very peripatetically across many fields. And so Chris always kept his deep, deep mathematical training, and he was looking for deep structure, deep pattern in the built environment, and very much in ecological systems as well. And Chris is a wonderful curmudgeon. So Chris would say, well, sustainability, wonderful, but so much of it is just so ugly and lifeless. And at first I was like, what are you talking about, Chris? I mean, the world's falling apart. I mean, we got to just get things done technically too. But he had some deep, deep points about how our response to the sustainability crisis needs to be deeply adapted, deeply attuned to place, tuned to the ecology. It should be beautiful. It should make us feel whole. And if we're on that path, if we're creating that kind of beauty together, then there's probably a way that we can connect it to the regeneration of different scales, from neighborhoods to bioregions to the planet.
How would you see the impact of Chris's work? Like, on the one hand, I mean, a pattern language is one of the classics that almost any architectural student will at least pretend that they've read or buy and have on their shelf. But I'm just wondering how many people are actually really taking deep enough of a dive into this opus that is really quite remarkable, to then understand it and apply it. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who've picked up on, oh, we're developing a pattern language for evolutionary work in human societies, and like lots of people work on pattern languages, and so that meme's definitely traveled. But particularly I find that the depth of work in the Nature of Order, which I only got through the first book, always thinking I can't wait to read the other 3, but I'm still thinking that. And how do you see it being? Has it percolated through? Has it reached people that actually put it into application?
Well, one of the fascinating things is this work has influenced many, many different fields, Daniel. So software, modern software, object-oriented programming languages, which is kind of the more modern generation of programming languages, starting with C++, moving on to Java, really the architecture of the world now, right? The coders all use this way of coding because it allows software to become this mycelial network of intersecting, intercommunicating programs. And the core people that developed those modern languages were hugely influenced by Chris's work, more from the pattern language. Nature of Order hadn't appeared yet, but they literally were looking at the beauty and elegance of a pattern-based way to perceive, to order knowledge, to have communication across teams and communities. They realized you could apply that to code. And they sort of had this hypothesis: elegant code is going to have deep, deep patterns. If you're constantly, trying to fix the latest bug and it's a kludge and you're building layer after layer of just these ridiculous fixes, it's very brittle. And they realized if you take the time to go incredibly deeply into the underlying patterns of the code, you can create elegance, and you can actually create software that can intercommunicate and evolve over decades. So those early programmers literally would sit around reading Chris's work, studying it together. My old neighbor in Berkeley, Ward Cunningham, It's just extraordinary visionary. Ward developed what's now known as Agile Programming, which has become agile in the broader sense of agile management, not needing to have years and years of planning, but actually adapting continuously as you're developing software or running a project. So Ward deeply studied Chris's work, used that to develop what's become the wiki. He created the very first wiki, literally, like the first page that any user could update as a way to play with patterns in software. And very quickly, that became Wikipedia.
Wow, okay. And in the kind of more built environment planning and sustainability field, who do you see as being kind of direct disciples or people who've really drawn from Chris's work?
That's a great question. Chris is a towering figure in architecture on a theoretical level. But when you try to apply his methods, which include deep, deep participation, it removes that barrier between, you've got the architect here and the client here, and they don't really interact beyond the client saying a few things. Chris turns it into a profoundly participatory process, and something that can be done with entire communities as they redesign neighborhoods. Doing that in practice has challenged the profession. It's been hard to contract around and so forth. So I would love to see profound explorations of Chris's notions of structure of wholeness and living systems, and figure out architectural practice around that. But it's tricky.
I'm wondering, like, whether you can help me think through something that I've not done the research on, but like maybe from knowing Chris well, I have a sense that there's a connection between David Seaman's work on which is a kind of phenomenological approach to architecture, and Christopher's work. And I believe, I know that David Seaman spent a lot of time at J.G. Bennett's lab, and one of the places that also have influenced the regenerative community and also the International Futures Forum, like Tony Hodgson and the Three Horizons and the World Systems Model, all come somehow influenced from these early days at Coombe Springs. And I know that certainly all the work that David Seaman has done is also influenced by that. And what recently, a couple of years ago, Rob Hopkins unearthed from Transition Towns, he unearthed an old paper of Christopher Alexander's, which is called Christopher Alexander's Challenge to Permaculture, where relatively early on, he was calling up the kind of permaculture layer approach of kind of the zones and kind of basically a design approach that is trying to create this integrative, self-sustaining permaculture whole of a farm or a landscape through additive processes, through processes that, like in Henry Botoft's, another Coombe Springs person, terms, talking about counterfeit holes rather than authentic holes, holes that are built up of parts, and then the whole, rather than in a more regenerative way, unveiling the whole that is there primary and the potential of the whole to manifest by really working from wholeness first, rather than creating wholeness by putting all the perfect design pieces into place. Do you know how close the link between, like, is there a link with Christopher Alexander and Coombe Springs and that whole lineage?
A light one, certainly. I think somewhat independently, Chris developed very profound ideas and methods around what he called the field of wholeness. So experiential methods to actually sense into what part of an ancient carpet, for instance, has this deep, deep wholeness, and how that connects to other wholes and linked networks of wholes. But as you're saying, Daniel, versus counterfeit wholes. I mean, looking at holons, looking at nested systems of wholes, but looking at very profound relationships, not just being contained within, right? So that's an important way we think about nested wholes. But wholes actually interact in all of these other rich ways. You may sort of leap up a few levels and connect over to another whole over here. And Chris wrote a really important paper called "A City is Not a Tree." And what he meant by that is if you have a tree-like structure where you always have to have a hierarchical way that you're integrating wholes, you'll get some artificiality, and that the real organic life of a city like Jane Jacobs might have celebrated actually involves more of a lattice structure, which is a much more flexible way that you can have different wholes interconnecting and supporting each other. So he thought about this incredibly profoundly, you know, in the nature of order. And what I love is it ultimately brings you back to phenomenology. It brings you back to the lived experience of a place, a room, a carpet. Chris collected these extraordinary Islamic rugs from circa 10th to the 14th centuries. He felt that time period was when the greatest artistry and wholeness was created. And he wrote a whole book about this called The Foreshadowing of 21st Century Art. And you know, collected these amazing, you know, ancient, like, you know, they look like they've got holes and the color's a bit off and like they've been there for centuries. And yet you look at them and they're beings. You just sink into this infinite interconnecting lattice. And it's a kind of a model of the entire world's wholeness.
I think that, and I'm not sure whether I'm putting ideas into Chris's thinking there, or whether my sense is that that's exactly where the connection is. It's the dimension of mind, the participatory process of being in relationship to other wholes, and
Yes.
that the way that and contained within others. Yeah. So that there is actually, when you contemplate a piece of art like that, it's there's something in you moving. It's not just out there, and
Yes.
that's precisely, I think, what all that larger school has in common. Paying attention to that the divide between mind and matter isn't quite as either or separate as current education has us trained in.
Well, exactly. And another key link is the work of David Bohm, who
Yeah.
was thinking about quantum mechanics in this very profound way that imbricated consciousness with the weaving of the universe and developed experiential techniques he called the dialogue technique, where you could have people in a room kind of going down and sensing kind of that emergent field, shared thoughts. And it's reminds me of Otto Scharmer's beautiful work too. It's almost like an early precursor of what Otto calls presencing.
Well, again, it's so beautiful, the links here, because basically the link to Bohm is that Henry Bothoft, who was also at Combe Springs, was one of Bohm's PhD students, and his whole, like, this work on the difference between, like, that paper from 1971 on counterfeit and authentic wholes. Otto's work, when you read Presence, the book that the precursor of Theory U, he actually deeply acknowledges that some of the pennies that dropped in a conversation with Henry Bothoft led him on to this new path that he then developed so beautifully. So I find it really fascinating the way that there is actually a deep sort of lineage in multiple ways that all dance around this participatory aspect of being in whole, bringing forth a world, like in Maturana and Varela's terms.
Yes. Well, Maturana and Varela, you know, with the beautiful, beautiful autopoiesis theory that we still haven't really understood or deeply incorporated within, you know, Western science. It's beautiful, and it's important to understand it emerged from South America. It emerged in Chile in a very distinct intellectual context, a global South context, an alternative epistemology, and also in, of course, the Chilean Renaissance, this extraordinary brief window when you had these amazing, you know, rich thinkers actually, you know, getting government ministries to run and so forth. But autopoiesis it's so important to me. I even named my company Autopoiesis. And everyone said, you know, don't do that. No one can spell it. No one can say it. No one knows what it means. But we, but we had to, because to me, it's the core inquiry. And so if we begin to weave this a little bit towards the work that I'm doing now, autopoiesis, self-organizing living systems, and that sense of a bounded being, that cellular membrane is so important in creating the context for that living being. And then the cells within the cells making up a body that also has its own autopoietic skin membrane encircling it. If we think about regeneration, the core way that I think it occurs in the world is what Macheron and Vrea called structural coupling, where literally you'd have two and several systems interacting kind of membrane to membrane in this profound direct way. And that if you can attend to those flows and interactions, which create various sorts of patterns and habits and a sense ultimately of nurturing and love, that if we attend to those at the scale of our household and then working our way out to our neighborhoods and immediate communities, out to the bioregion that we might really love and fall in love with, identify with, connect with, whether it's the mountain range, right, that holds us, or the river, or in your case, you have this extraordinary Mediterranean Sea lapping at the beach, you know, half a mile away. It's that those places are just the weaving of these structural couplings, the deep interlock of all of these beings as they connect. And Maturana in his 90s is still vibrant and still developing this work. And a few years ago, he wrote a new book really arguing that the basis of cognition is love. That after 50 years, 60 years of trying to understand autopoietic living systems, he realized what is forged in the earliest relationship between a baby and the mother, the father, young organisms of all species, and even broader processes, not just living in the narrow biological sense. But if we think about the living processes of the universe, that really that love and connection maybe is the core of it all. And so what does regeneration mean? We're attending to that in every cell of our body at every scale. And we can empirically, you know, look out and experience this. And of course, we can develop all kinds of sophisticated, you know, models and dashboards and you know, begin to abstract from that and say, is our bioregion, you know, within its fair share of planetary boundary conditions and so forth. So we need all of those things as well. But I'd like to remind us that that deep experience of your own body as a regenerative system in every moment, all of those around you, all of your different human communities, and then the places that you inhabit and all of their beings. You know, my neighbor, David Abram, here in Santa Fe, he's just up the hill. He's been a dear friend for many, many years. And David wrote this beautiful book called The Spell of the Sensuous. Yeah, and again, back to phenomenology, yeah. You know, David kind of unearthed the 20th century deep thinking of people like Merleau-Ponty about deep experience, like how do we experience life? And then wove that all together and taught us that we're really part of this weaving with the more than human world. You know, it's more than human. We couldn't imagine ourselves without these fellow beings, without these allies. And we cannot regenerate the world as one species. It's restoring the flows and the energy and the lines of communication with all of these other species, their habitats, their ecosystems. They can regenerate, they can bounce back, and we can't possibly steward and control all of this. It's like it's just calling back our allies, including, you know, the mountains and the rivers and all of these other species.
Yeah, no, what you've just said touches on so many aspects of, like, I've only done a few roles of being a second PhD supervisor on a couple of PhDs, and one of them is a guy called Gonzalo Salazar, who's a Chilean who did his PhD at the same institute where I did mine, with Seton Baxter. And he actually built his entire PhD work on drawing from Maturana's work and basically expressing, using this idea that we bring forth a world in conversation, which links to the whole kind of living the questions together that runs through my work.
Yes.
And we bring it forth through love, like weaving in both Maturana's biology of love, but also the notion of biophilia that has been around for quite a while, but that E.O. Wilson has kind of popularized. And for me, that this, like mentioning David Abram, I think David Abram's book is just so beautiful, that Spell of the Sensuous. And there's this one paragraph where he says that our senses and who we are have been shaped in conviviality with all other living
Yes.
beings. Like our ears have
Yes.
been attuned to the howling of the wolves and the hoot of the owls. Our eyes have been sharpened by the deer running. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it's just pure poetry, and it speaks to exactly that larger conversation of how, like for me, I'm people get a little bit touchy when overeducated, privileged white guys like me talk about the importance of indigenous knowledge. But I do feel that that is part of the problem of now coming to a true healing if we don't allow so-called non-indigenous people. We're all indigenous to planet Earth, and I think that ultimately, whether we call it re-inhabitation like the early bioregionalists did, or we call it re-indigenization, becoming native to place again, even if we weren't born there, but by having these larger conversations, I think that's at the heart of what we're trying to do with our work in regeneration. It's about those, how do we connect to place, how do we connect to region and to planet, but in a way that supports and maintains the whole community of life at all those scales. So how
Yeah.
did you make that? How did you make that journey? So from working with Christopher, you then set up your company, Autopoiesis, and worked for 10, 15 years in that. And then that's when you ended up getting headhunted by the Capital Institute.
Well, there was another really important stop along the way, which is a wonderful nonprofit conservation organization called EcoTrust. And they're based in what they call Salmon Nation, which I love. It's really the places the salmon can swim to on the west coast of North America, the Pacific coast. And it's a vast, vast region, my home region, right in the heart of salmon territory. And so EcoTrust, even back in the early 2000s, when I spent 3 years there, was exploring what they called a conservation economy. So kind of an interesting precursor, maybe twin to a regenerative economy. And we were literally exploring pattern languages for bioregional regeneration and how that could roll up to create a conservation economy. And the wonderful thing about EcoTrust is they are continuing, they're still thriving 25 years later. They're still experimenting on the ground with things like ecological forestry investment funds. So we helped connect one of those early funds with federal level resources in the early 2000s. So very practically saying, could you take a little bit of what we just discussed, Daniel? I mean, there's no way to bring the depth of that field of wholeness and the depth of those relationships of structural coupling and sensing place. Those are fundamentally indigenous ways of knowing and being. There's no way to bring that into an abstract financial transaction. That's the key conundrum, right? But even back in the early 2000s, EcoTrust was wrestling. They had incredible ecologists on staff, actually a very strong program in indigenous knowledge. To their credit, it's always been core for EcoTrust to draw on the wisdom of
Right,
the
in that region, those cultures are still
diversity,
very strong as well.
extraordinary,
Right?
and still, and still vibrant cultures. The Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwagyuth, where I grew up. And so they were trying to bridge things like indigenous knowledge with modern forest management and somehow bring that into an investment term sheet that says you'll somehow get some returns tied to the health of the land and not just to the extraction from the land.
Wow.
And they continue, with that inquiry. So, the bridge for me was working with people like Chris and Sim, testing ideas around what we now call regenerative design. We call it ecological design. It's all the same weaving. Working with those ideas, trying to shift into practically getting things built on the ground, or practically shifting from awful, industrial forestry in the Pacific Northwest to this day, you're clear cutting every 40 years or so and just leaving this devastated landscape because it seems to optimize, the most extractive, version, of the economic model where you've externalized everything, the ravaged communities, destroyed ecosystems. Just if you can ignore that and you run the numbers, it looks like you cut it every 40 years or so. We were trying to say, what if you have a whole range of values and you're perceiving and understanding connectivity, between all of these different parties, so that maybe there's a nearby municipality that benefits from much better water quality and quantity. Could they, be a part of this? So all those explorations, whether it's the built environment, working a lot with green buildings and saying, okay, can we make it even more energy efficient, less toxic, more joyful and abundant for the people within it? Does that pencil? And so I got really obsessed in the early 2000s with, why deep living management of ecosystems, that could be informed by traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing, or building, in a way that would allow us to be whole and to preserve all the broader systems around us, so that you're not manufacturing anything toxic that causes harm to workers and ecosystems that you then bring into the building that causes harm to the occupants, that you then dispose of that causes harm somewhere else. Why did that seem to pencil? The toxicity, the ridiculous energy use, right? Or on the land side, why did it seem to make sense to clear cut or to do industrial agriculture? And that led me, to the next inquiry, to, well, clearly finance and economics are completely disconnected from life, from living systems, from our lived experience, and we have to reinvent it. And so with our company Autopoiesis, we explored, regenerative ownership models, financing models, regenerative design, and really kind of bringing that weave back together. And it was, messy and complicated. Again and again, we would literally hit, divergent worldviews. Yeah. Finally, like just so deep, where you're just rushing to get the final financing. How do you talk to a loan officer about autopoiesis, about living systems? They're happy to talk to you about the other benefits ecologically and socially, but at the end of the day, they just cannot see beyond what they've been taught. Yeah. And what they just feel so deeply is the essence of the project, which is this line of numbers. And so we played with, could you create the economic proformas that included ecological and social value layers? Mm-hmm. And so that, with Autopoiesis, we teamed up with our shared colleague, Jason Twill, who's now based in Australia. We launched this project called the Economics of Change to really work with real estate investors, all kinds of different actors in that system, to say, could we open a space to layer on economic value, social, ecological value, and begin to quantify it? And again, it's a deep epistemological mistake to think you could take our lived experience or ecological thriving and somehow turn it into a series of numbers. But we played with that. We tried to find ways to communicate, the extreme integrated set of benefits from a regenerative building project, and did that work for several years. And again, these deep worldview conflicts where individuals at GE Capital and different real estate firms would totally understand it. We could talk as individuals. And they, of course, I just went out fishing and I get it. I love it. You know, if we could incorporate ecosystem values, we'd get better buildings. And yet they couldn't single-handedly move their company.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you brought up Jason, because as you were speaking before you mentioned him, I was thinking how there was a parallel between what you were describing in what he was recalling of his work of trying to transform the big players in the built environment industry, like
Exactly.
developers, and also like my conversation with Bill Reed, sort of how very often when Regenesis gets hired for a job, there's that moment where the client doesn't quite get it, what they are on about, because what they're really looking is at the finished designed development project and the values that they can achieve by selling it. And whereas the deeper deliverable of working in that regenerative way is really the capability of the entire system to self-manifest from each of the people in the company, but all the people they touch in the community being lifted to being able to manifest their potential through the process of working in that way. And it's just a complete shift, one of those Kuhnian cubes where it suddenly looks all very different, but it's the same cube. And most companies still find it very hard to make that shift. It takes a while for them to understand the deeper significance.
Yes, and the work of Regenesis is so beautiful and profound, you know, to begin to say, could the unfolding of a building, a small development, actually lead to these regenerative capacities being enhanced in everybody touching the project in any way, and potentially even creating a whole ecosystem of organizations. And that's the level, I think, where you can actually begin to shift the kinds of transactional models, the investment, the ownership models, when you start to have a vibrant ecosystem, many, many different organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, academic institutions, different levels of government, beginning to perceive with a whole systems perspective, beginning to have this regenerative impulse and this shared sense, could we unfold this potential together? And that can happen in nested scales.
And how did you connect with John and make that move over to the Capital Institute then? Because I mean, in many ways, that's the heart of your work now, but you're now working with all these initiatives within the Regenerative Communities Network, where people have come together saying, yes, we can do this, and the appropriate scale to do this kind of work is at the bioregional level. So let's home in on that work, sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this bioregional transformation process ever since EcoTrust days, you know, looking really practically at Salmon Nation, right? So one very large, beautiful, bioculturally diverse region, and thinking what could we do to systemically rewire the economy there and build that sort of capacity? And it was early days and rough experiments. And now, you know, revisiting in the light of just incredible work that's happened, you know, for decades now, and we, you know, starting with sustainability, moving to resilience, moving to regeneration, it's all a huge weave. And increasingly, these words, these movements can become something much deeper, differentiated still perhaps, but working very powerfully together with self-awareness. In a similar way to working with Three Horizons gives you coherent ways to think about different timescales and strategies for action. So if we think about Capital Institute's work in regenerative economics, they launched in 2010. I sort of found them very early on. I'm like, what is this? This is amazing. Because almost no one was thinking about regenerative economics or really thinking about deep economic and financial systems redesign from the perspective of living systems. And so I was following that work. I met John around 2013. We talked a lot, worked on a few projects together. And then the time was right in 2017 to say, look, could we take the thought leadership work, John's pivotal 2015 paper on regenerative capitalism, some wonderful storytelling work that had been done, and really say, what would this mean on the ground, right? How could we imagine, design a process for unfolding a regenerative economy at a large landscape, at a bioregional scale? what would that process look like? How can we nurture it? How can we feed it? How can we support it? And so we kind of drew on Meg Wheatley's wonderful work on what she calls emergent networks. So this is very different than, oh yeah, there are 10 or 15 well-defined projects, and we just set up a trade association, and it's a nice way to communicate and move things forward. This was a bit different because we didn't really know of any bioregions on this path. And so we kind of put up a flare and said, okay, here's just a light of, is anybody interested in this journey? Is anybody on this journey? Does this even make sense? And that's really been the spirit. Is when you do an emergent network, you try to give it the loosest possible kind of organizing integrity. And in our case, we said, look, would you be interested in kind of experimenting with, say, principles of regenerative economics and regeneration more broadly? And we flew up that flare and started to get some inquiries. Okay, this is very interesting. Some of us have been thinking about this. Some organizations are interested and so forth. And so we now have interest that we can't possibly address. There are just dozens of bioregions around the world that want to play and be connected with this. So for now, Daniel, we have 15 bioregions on 4 continents, a lot of activity in Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, United States and Canada, lovely project in the UK, in South Devon, and then Nepal. So the idea is to learn from each other, so bioregion to bioregion pure learning, to support this kind of regenerative unfolding at bioregional scale. And that starts with kind of some early energy, a strong enough team, strong enough capacity to say, yes, we can anchor this long term. So that could be a handful of people in organizations, ideally from very diverse sectors, perspectives, very deep and hopefully not completely overlapping networks of connection. And then picture it like this. Within a bioregion, you're trying to grow a mycelium of regeneration, a mycelial, a fungal root network of regeneration. So it's not about a scorecard and sort of you're in, you're out, I'll work with you or not. It's like wherever those hyphae, wherever those mycelial root tips, right, can connect and say, nutrients can flow here. We may not quite understand each other yet, but we're finding a way to work regeneratively where we can go deep and begin to connect with each other's being and connection and intention and not be thrown off by words and frameworks and just cognitive thinking, actually drop down a few levels to really the level of what Otto Scharmer would call presencing. You drop to that level and begin to unfold prototypes and possibilities from that deep level of shared field, of beginning to map and sense and see from a living systems perspective, from a whole systems perspective. So practically, in different regions in the Regenerative Communities Network, you've got this weaving happening. So you've got all of these different organizations and individuals beginning to connect together, find each other, launch initiatives in a very flexible, decentralized way. And we feel that our role is to support 8 key dimensions of regenerative infrastructure. And these have been kind of co-identified and co-created with the network. So again, as an emergent network, we didn't quite know what would be most helpful. And what we've sort of converged on for the moment, and this will continue to evolve, is kind of 8 areas, 8 dimensions that can support this mycelial growth. So education.
They don't map against the 8 qualities of regenerative economics that
Correct. So the 8 principles give us what we call kind of
I prefer calling them qualities. And in the last conversation I had with John, John is switching to calling them qualities as well.
I like that. I like that very much. Christopher Alexander actually played with that and decided to use qualities, or in fact, he called them properties. He identified 15 properties of wholeness that are quite profound. So yes, if we think about the 8 qualities of a regenerative economy, that gives us kind of a North Star, a purpose for the work. So we're trying to explore together, move towards achieving those principles as interpreted by that particular biocultural context. What I love about those qualities is that they're generative. So I think John really designed them in a way that would enable deep inquiry, open up, the right kinds of questions versus just very cut and dried, more technical principles. They're when you
But
look at quality.
you were just about to name
Yes.
them, and you named education. Which one of the qualities of a regenerative economist do you see education match to?
So right. So the qualities of a regenerative economy include things like being in right relation, or encouraging adaptation and innovation, or edge effect abundance, where you're kind of, it's the mycelial metaphor. It's literally, you've got one big mycelium here, another one over here. What happens when they begin to connect? And you have this unexpected nutrient flow between them. So that's kind of the overall guiding purpose. But then how do we do the work? And of course, there are deep, deep qualities of being underneath all of this. And that's a whole nother way to think about the work. But there are 8 dimensions of just practically getting on with it. And those include, regenerative education. So everything from deep thinking about regenerative worldviews to all kinds of practical skills. How do you actually do agroforestry? How do you create a food forest garden, right? How do you do marine restoration and regeneration? All of those kinds of things. Transformative leadership. So how do you actually become what we call a systems convener? How do you work in a bi-regional context or any context in a way that unfolds potential, it creates a sense of possibility and coherence? So education, leadership, narrative framing, very important. So that's the third one. Storytelling. And Capital Institute actually did a lot of beautiful work that was captured in what we call the Field Guide to a Regenerative Economy. So 50 case studies of regenerative enterprises from the US and other parts of the world. So storytelling, narrative, being able to really story this within a region, to know, these sort of sparks are happening and connecting and doing learning journeys around those. The fourth one is having a platform for collaboration and communication. And we've experimented with one, so a digital platform that's called HiveBright. It's fine. And there's a real deep art to actually curating a digital community. And we haven't solved that as a network. I'm talking to many other people like David Hodson and Steve Waddell with SDG Transformations Forum. We're all kind of wrestling with how do you digitally hold this work?
Yeah. I mean, because I signed up for that platform, and recently I re-engaged with it, and it just felt like it hasn't really caught up, like to a point where there's a lot of conversation going on. Like I was surprised, having like felt bad that I hadn't dropped in for maybe 3 months, and then I realized that not that much had actually been going on, or I couldn't find it.
I know there's a fine art to onboarding a digital community, feeding it, curating, having people engaged, and it's just not something we've been able to put sufficient focus to. So what's happened is, in the different bioregions, they're all evolving their own multiple platforms and websites and WhatsApp channels and on and on and on. And so it's cobbled together, and we don't have enough visibility, right? If we had a shared platform that could connect the work effectively, it would make all of the work visible and so forth. So we're in conversations with other networks just in the same place. Everyone's sort of got platform fatigue, right? It's too hard to have one more place to engage digitally. So we're realizing we've gone back to actually the soft networks in place are by far the most important. The people that are, consciously meeting, connecting, doing things together in person, walking the land together, doing a learning journey, launching long-term collaboratives, that nothing can replace that level of communication and collaboration. So then to kind of complete, those 8 layers. So all of that is kind of sensing into the system and supporting some of the key capacities to do the work. Then you need real ways to do systems mapping, to really understand geospatially, right? The layers, the water layers and energy, metabolic flows of materials, socioeconomic layers. But then, more importantly, causal system dynamics. So really using something like Kumu to do deep systems mapping around power relations, causality within the region. But then other layers. So our colleague Glenn Page is doing amazing work on what he calls transformation system analysis and mapping. So literally trying to understand those key nodal intervention points, leverage points in the system, and developing the fine art of actually mapping and communicating that together. And it's an emerging field, and we're hosting a working group around transformation system analysis because no one quite can do it yet in practice. We've got some tantalizing clues.
I need to get in touch with Glenn because I would love for him to run that fledgling process against the 10 years of work and the network that I've established here on Mallorca, and to see whether it would give any insights on how to, particularly now that tourism is dead in the water after the pandemic. There's now, compared to when you came and visited here, like the whole positioning that I was doing of trying to convince tourism to be the economic engine of paying for the re-regionalization and the whole regenerative process at the island scale is now not really an option anymore. So it's going to be interesting. But yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. So that systems mapping flows very naturally into design and planning at bioregional scale, which I know you've been deeply involved with and worked on Gaia education courses around. It's an emerging discipline, taking regenerative design approaches, things Regenesis Group has pioneered with Story of Place, but then many other practitioners and fields. There is a very profound field of regional planning pioneered by Ian McHarg, and so kind of weaving together some very deep thinking from landscape architecture, regional planning, but then saying it's not just the land planning, right? It's deeply understanding the economic transformation, the social and cultural factors, and as you would say, it's really how do we design a regenerative culture for that bioregion, and of course in a completely collaborative way, and then in a way that isn't just cultures on the side. It is enacting regenerative culture. It is enacting a regenerative bioregion, which means you've got to reground, rewire all of the economic activity, and you're rewiring the built environment, you're rewiring social relations and so forth, and finding this adaptive deep fit over time that in many cases relies on traditional ecological knowledge, traditional ways of knowing. So the cycle then gets very practical around mapping, designing and planning, evaluating. And the network has adopted a very beautiful approach called Blue Marble evaluation, which was developed by Michael Quinn Patton, who is a global leader in this sort of field of how do you evaluate and assess projects of all types. And it's called Blue Marble because you have that image of the earth, floating in space. So your evaluation is literally, is this going to be transformative at different scales in a way that will help us shift to a thriving Gaian system? And so literally,
I'm still looking for it. Like it's lying here on the table.
Ah, do you have it?
Yeah. I was gonna hold it up, but I can't find it right now. But yeah, I finally, it was one of the last books to arrive before the madness
great
started. So
that's great. And so we're really kind of a test case within the RCN for Blue Marble to really look at a bioregional scale where you have this rich complexity. So if you're trying to assess how well you're doing in terms of governance and what they call the enabling conditions for a long-term sustained regenerative process, you can actually assess that qualitatively. And you can even get to some very simple quantitative metrics when that's helpful. But from this sense, not of any surface thing like, oh yeah, our water quality was slightly better in this, sub-hydrological basin, our CO2 slightly better in this building. Those are important. But this is deep, deep. Do we have long-term conditions that will enable the learning, the transformation? to occur. And so we're just testing this now. We're just kind of co-creating with different bioregions. How would you do a baseline, right? To say, here's where we are in the transformational process. As we start in a place like Mallorca, here are things that we can tell immediately will be weaknesses as we begin our transformational process. We'll immediately begin to address those. We'll build deeper and deeper information flows, collaboration processes, ways of understanding together how to continuously adapt our work. And then it connects, of course, to capital. So at the end of the day, if we're going to rewire these bioregional economies so that literally they are regenerative economies, so that the flows, the ownership patterns, the inclusivity, the ability to participate is truly regenerative, then we've got to shift the investment within the bioregion. And we need to decarbonize, we need to regenerate land, we need to create systemic ways to include people in economic participation, flows that can disperse to the very edges and distribute out throughout the bioregion rather than being highly centralized, typically in powerful urban centers. How do we have distributed prosperity?
One of the dilemmas that I see, or the real challenges that entails, is that in order to re-energize a re-regionalized, thriving, regenerative economy at the bioregional scale, you need to do things that now, in the context of the pandemic that we're in the middle of, are beginning to make a lot more sense to a lot more people, because we're now seeing how brittle our global supply chains produce on demand kind of supply chains of vast distances with enormous externalized social and environmental costs are breaking down everywhere. And so the argument for re-regionalization and economic diversification at the local and regional scale in order to put people back into employment after so many systems are collapsing around us now is going to be easier to some extent. But as we look into how to meet human needs within, not just meet them within the opportunities and constraints of a given ecosystem bioregion, but to increase food, water, energy, self-sufficiency, well, or let's call it self-reliance or sovereignty, not a kind of capsuling off from the world. There'll still be trade. And to do so in such a way that it actually also fits with the ecosystem's restoration agenda and the drawdown agenda and the healing of soils and the healing of waterways and the bringing back of forests and the rewilding of land, but still producing food rather than somewhere on the other side of the globe with near slave labor and then have it imported locally. There are quite a lot of really tight ropes to walk on in order to, for example, if I'm thinking of it, as I so often do with the island of Mallorca where I live, on the one hand, we need to bring back many more trees, and like we're currently working on a project called Baleares Verdes to plant a million trees in food forests all around the island. But we also need to, that's why they need to be food forests. We need to somehow produce more food for the local population as we have done so far. And so, yeah, it's a complex refitting of the human presence back into ecosystems as regenerative presences rather than degenerative presences.
Yes, exactly. And we need to attend to the current state, which is this incredibly complex evolutionary process that has involved harnessing the power of thermodynamics and the power of coal, early in the 19th century with large-scale industrialization, and all the different pathways to our current, digital economy. All of this has been contingent. All of it has deep, fascinating stories. There are very tragic stories of various empires that have caused problems in different areas. All of this needs to be woven together, and we need to look squarely at the kind of the complex, wicked mess that the world is in, and get to work unraveling that and regenerating it. So we have to understand how capital is held now and create viable models for a just transition so that we shift. We may have a right of complementary currencies, commons-backed currencies. We may have very different kinds of economic investment vehicles. We may have rich ways that we're connecting together financial capital, social capital, ecological capital. We haven't quite solved that weave yet.
But this is just sorry to interrupt there, but because it brings back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. I see a huge amount of very well-meaning people working with these frames of financial capital, ecological capital, social capital, and the whole bunch of nuances of naming a few others. And on the one hand, I know that the people that I know in this world are trying to use these terms so we can actually create the framework that allows the internalization of externalities to internalize in our balance sheet all the socio-ecological effects of bad household management, bad economics, and an extractive economy. The danger, and where I feel like, how do we safeguard ourselves against that? The minute we create this multi-capital system, the temptation to create that formula that converts all other capitals to economic capital is so high, and it will actually be asked for. It will be required from the investor types because they can only think in that one unit. And the minute we do that, that whole group, I'm saying we, like all of us trying to do this work in service to life and in service to the continued evolution of life on this planet, might find ourselves suddenly see that work that we've built with the best of intentions be co-opted for the largest form of enclosure ever known in human history, that all other enclosure of the commons moves would be tiny against, because the minute we have the vehicle to quantify in financial terms human relationships and the value of ecosystems, then yeah, we've brought it all into the market.
No, exactly. And so it's a weaving of multiple forms of capital, not an interconvertibility. So it's understanding their essence, how in unique ways in different parts of the world, and not allowing a direct way to or purchase natural capital, but to simply map it and set it and begin to understand in a holistic, unified way how connect, flow, properly engage, and support all of that. So let me back up. The capitals are incredibly awkward, incomplete approximations of what actually is an undifferentiated, unified process of life. We on this planet, this unified Gaia biosphere, it is one integral being with processes that create the life for all of us, that nourishes all of us. So maybe we need to back all the way up to saying we need to support an economic system that's conducive to life. And we've allowed economic flows to distort and hurt and even kill living processes on this planet. We can redesign them, but there will be a transition that's necessary. We need to understand the deep structure of capital patterns, because that's the way economic flows have been constructed. We need to map out how those flows can shift so that that system actually ends up being conducive to life. To talk about a unified way of supporting the regeneration of every single watershed on this planet. That's what we talk about with regenerative economics. How do we support the regeneration of every watershed, every continent on this planet, every ecosystem, and all of the human communities.
That's our shared mission.
But I can't emphasize enough the transition question, right? we can imagine fresh economic systems that I think are conducive to life. And Capital Institute has really focused on that, and many others, like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. There's such a rich diversity of work, uncountable, exciting, dynamic visions of where we could go. But there's so little work on the deep question. How can we make a culturally palatable narrative around how that transition will work? How can we run numbers from this reductionist economy to this holistic, unified economy? How do you even translate and build bridges between them? And how do you map out, literally turning down the petro-economy and everything that's the petro-extractive economy, where financial flows have largely been tied to how much can you extract, how quickly. That's how they're designed. It's like not a great design. It drove all kinds of interesting things. It can't go on like that. So we need to shift the regenerative economy. And literally, Daniel, it's so simple. It's literally shifting from you're rewarded for extracting and destroying, just because that's the system's design. No one is guilty of doing this. It's just the system's design. If I'm a bright person and I can use these flows in a certain way, I can do well for my family and extended community. And I forget that at the end of the day, it's tied to something destroying life somewhere else. On the other hand, if we can rebuild an economy where the flows are based on how much are you regenerating and reweaving and reconnecting, restoring place by place, you're turning the extractive, you're bringing up the regenerative, and you've got to have a way to communicate that story at a national level, at a UN level, at a community level. And I feel like we're on the verge of building that story. So for instance, I have a wonderful colleague working at a nonprofit, literally mapping how do we turn off the oil infrastructure systematically in an optimal way over time. That's how we're building up the regenerative economy. We can model that globally. They're very powerful software models to do that. And we can story that, right? We've got to build a space, a political space to story that removes the fear of, well, if we, without oil, we're gonna starve, all the food chains, will collapse and so forth. We have to story it in a way that we can have a stable transition. But that's an incredibly deep technical problem as well. It's most deeply cultural and worldview problem of how to even want and imagine our way into that. But technically, it's really interesting and deep and solvable to really map out, shutting down the petro, turning up the regeneration, and doing that maybe over 10 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that maybe just before we wind up, because we could easily talk for another 2 hours, the two projects that we've been connecting on, both the Regenerosity platform as one experiment of how to both showcase, connect to each other, and also connect to potential investors and also philanthropic funders, regenerative projects around the world, and then the work with the British, or the former British Commonwealth, now the Commonwealth of Nations. How do you see those two initiatives, what is now turning into the Commonwealth Alliance, taking a critical role in that, and also the enabling structure that the Regenerosity Network that we've been working on, how do you see them fitting it into this story?
Yes. Well, let me start with Regenerosity. It's part of this wonderful ecosystem of transformative projects around regenerating economics. Not just funding specific regenerative projects, but literally regenerating finance, regenerating economics in a deep sense, regenerating what that can mean. So Regenerosity is looking very practically at connecting visionary projects that applied to, say, the Buckminster Fuller Challenge, giving them more visibility, telling their stories, having a shared digital platform to connect to foundations and even private investors that would be aligned. We're seeing all kinds of experiments around, software platforms, even just loose social communities that can take a rich, diverse range of projects and connect them to fund. Give you kind of a second example to show you that regenerosity is happening in kind of this rich mix of invention. There's a very important initiative called 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people. It's been convened, I'm sure you know it, by Eco-Agriculture Partners, UNDP, World Wildlife Fund, Sustainable, a landscape scale investment platform where you have very much like a bioregional collaborative, the Regenerative Communities Network, a vibrant landscape convening, right? An ongoing way to get key landowners and then representatives of grassroots landowners, get them to have a shared picture of their landscape, where it could go regeneratively, and then present a coherent portfolio of projects to investors.
One of the key partners in that is Common Land, and I like
Yes.
with my work here, I'm basically, I think that's actually the easiest way in for my particular case study here on Mallorca. Is if I can position the full return strategy and Common Land kind of work as a vision for the redevelopment of the Balearic economy across the 4 islands, and then using the existing link that Common Land has to Ecosystems Restoration Camp and the spinning out of Ecosystems Restoration Camp and John Liu's work, linking that with the already existing proposal for this Baleares, where I think then there might be, particularly in this new situation, a platform where we can actually begin to start this really complicated local work of enrolling all these different perspectives, people that have made a lot of money in tourism for 50 years, but don't really have the kind of holistic worldview that would be a wonderful precondition for having a better syntony in this conversation. Like initially, it will be a clash of worldviews. There will be a lot of co-learning to bridge languages and all that. And having lived for 10 years the actual day-to-day complexity of trying something as audacious of turning an entire island economy around. We've had this conversation before. I constantly find that there is a tension to the kind of global connecting and global storytelling, and how do we do this in a global way, globally applied, regionally applied, but globally collaborative, in solidarity and connected, and through peer-to-peer learning, energizing the whole process. It's that tension between each and every one of us having to make a decision of how much of our energy, spirit, breath, attention we give to the cohesiveness of the network and the co-learning and the kind of storytelling we can do together. And then, because so much of the basic assumption is that it has to come out of place, it has to be attuned to biocultural uniqueness. So it's this slight almost contradiction that we're trying to create patterns and processes, but we're deeply acknowledging that they will be slightly different or completely different in different contexts.
Yes.
So how do you like, because this must be the case for every single member and every single of the initiatives that you're working with. Like, to put it sort of simply in an example, it's like, how many Zoom calls do I have with the RCN, with the Regenerative Community Network each month, and how many local kind of world cafes and meetings with local government and local activists groups and local business owners do I have, in local universities, in order to enlist more and more people into the regional alliance? Has that already panning out a little bit with all your members?
No, absolutely. The systems conveners in each of the bioregions that we're supporting are extraordinary people. They're busy. They have incredible demands on their time. And we're trying to provide shared infrastructure that has real immediate practical value. Things like Blue Marble, things like a shared regenerative investment platform, which we're also working on, within the RCN. In fact, Mexico City is pioneering this fantastic thing, SVX Mexico, which is a regenerative finance lab, which will become a fund soon to fund projects throughout Latin America. Those things have tangible immediate value. So we're only interested in giving the bioregions practical things that they can run with. And what we ask in return is the learning, that the bioregions learn from each other, and that we try to capture that and weave that back into this entire network flow of learning. But you're absolutely right, that you can't spend all of your time telling your story to 5 different global networks. I mean, the work is on the ground. That's what matters. And if you're getting really valuable tools and processes from your alliance with different networks and kind of local initiatives, great. But those platforms, those tools, those processes have to be deeply attuned to place. And so you're scaling across, you're not taking some rigid set of rules and applying it into place. You're taking Blue Marble that is just very deeply adaptive to place-based expression. Mm-hmm. So let me just tie that back to Common Earth as we wrap up. So Common Earth, which you've been instrumental in, Daniel, and many of our colleagues, Common Earth is quite extraordinary. It's an effort to bring regenerative development into the 54 nations of the Commonwealth of Nations. And this very courageous, small Common Earth nonprofit for 3 or 4 years now has been convening at the Commonwealth level, bringing together regenerative development practitioners with key national representatives from nations ready to move, at least with the pilot project, at least some region, that is connected to this. So something extraordinary is happening now, where the nations of the Commonwealth are getting very excited about the original thought to do a regenerative roadmap at national scale. So there's testing at regional scale, various regenerative processes throughout the Commonwealth. And that's created enough excitement that now is the time to say, New Zealand, creating a regenerative roadmap that would be a national approach to regeneration in its ecological, economic dimensions, literally thinking about rewiring it towards a regenerative economy, literally regenerating ecosystems, literally working on the weaving of human communities. So Maori communities would be critically important in leading such an initiative. So all the way from, yes, we're going to decarbonize, we'll meet drawdown type goals, we can use drawdown type strategies on the carbon side, but then all these other things, completely rewiring the economy and using this as a way to build regenerative capacity. So you're not doing all of this just at a technical level. You're doing it in a way that is bringing people together in this powerful, powerful weaving and reconnecting them with their place. Could such a thing be mapped out? So we're experimenting with this in Costa Rica. So emerging from the work of the Regenerative Communities Network, Edward Muller is leading an effort to talk about, what would a regenerative roadmap look like for Costa Rica? How could that inform efforts in New Zealand, other parts of the Commonwealth? We're hearing, kind of murmurings that Iceland might do such a thing in connection with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So this is another really interesting scale of regeneration that's emerging, I think, Daniel, where with the Regenerative Communities Network, we've been really focused on bioregion and watershed, really tangible, physical, delineated by mountains and grasslands and things you can touch and see. But nations tend to have somewhat arbitrary boundaries. However, they have a gravitas and energy. They are typically what you go to the UN with and engage in climate negotiations and biodiversity negotiations with. There's no reason not to engage regeneration at national scale as well, particularly small nations. So New Zealand's, Iceland's, Costa Rica's relatively small countries in area and population seem to be viable. They're almost like small groups of bioregions that you really could imagine. Yeah, you could have every single bioregion in Costa Rica or New Zealand vibrant and really bubbling up and and doing powerful grassroots up work that you then kind of roll up and say, well, that becomes an integrated way. We go up and down scales from watershed, bioregion, up to nation and back down. And as we have a handful of these nations saying, yes, we're charting out a very deliberate regenerative pathway, suddenly you have another model at the UN level.
I mean,
another way to meet the SDGs or climate goals, but do so many other things as well.
Ever since I helped Roller convene that first meeting that Common Earth grew out of over the last, well, but now it's 4 years. I really felt sort of almost spellbound by the potential that would lie, and also the potential of using what historically is a strange club that has been born out of colonialism, but really turning that historical trauma and grief around, and now really empowering, like the story of New Zealand is just amazing because it is so strongly carried by the regenerative practitioners in New Zealand. I just recently connected somebody from a Maori tribe connected to my work, wanted to bring it to her tribe, and she was just over the moon to hear that there were all these Maori elders already deeply steeped in regenerative work and already having explored how similar the deeper value and insights actually are between that kind of Western developed frame around regeneration and their own indigenous cosmovision that they've been carrying as a wisdom carrier for millennia. So it's really beautiful that work is coming together. But you said, like, I always thought it was 53 nations, or has Costa Rica now joined the Commonwealth because they're doing a roadmap?
Well, actually, it's very helpful that Costa Rica is not part of the Commonwealth because it can provide a neutral example. So rather than bring up any sort of sense of competition or, you know, my regenerative roadmap's better than yours, having just a neutral, well-respected external country, a country known for peace, no standing army, known for having one of the highest shares of protected land, for Costa Rica, you know, to just gently set this example and say, this isn't final. We're learning alongside all of you. It gives the Commonwealth, ironically, kind of room to maneuver. And so we see this very rich dialogue just happening now between Costa Rica and New Zealand, thinking about these regenerative roadmaps. Australia wants to play, you know, various nations within and outside the Commonwealth. And, you know, it just brings me to a very simple definition of regeneration. It's just learning to be human in a more than human world. And the traditional cultures, you like that? Traditional cultures have focused on the incredibly exquisite, challenging, sometimes painful task of being human in community and knowing what that means in terms of our relation to the broader, more than human world, to the other beings, both biological and the stone beings and the water beings and that interbeing.
It's a lovely, is that your definition? Learning to be human?
I just thought of it.
Beautiful. No, this is, I mean, it's entirely aligned with, you know, the guy that I like, there's a guy in Japan called Christopher Chase, who I've been curating a couple of Facebook pages with over the last few years. And we had a conversation in which similar like that just emerged out of you, this idea of really at the essence of it, life is a regenerative community. That's what, like, if we want to say, how does life create conditions conducive to life? Well, life is not a bunch of individuals fighting for survival. Life is a planetary process that makes the entire planet more apt for more life to be more, to generate more abundance, more diversity, and keep integrating that diversity and abundance predominantly through collaborative processes. Competition is just sort of fine-tuning around the edges. The real process of life is symbiosis and integration through collaboration. And in many ways, learning to be human in a more than human world is another way of saying, how do we fit into that more than human community of life, and how will we fit into that pattern of creating conditions conducive to life. So yeah, beautiful, I love it.
Yeah.
Perfect place to end. We should have another one of this conversation.
Well, I need to wrap. This has been so lovely, and I just want to finish with a couple of thoughts. When we think about bioregional regeneration, we can also engage even with large companies. I don't want to leave the impression that this is strictly about relocalizing everything. And here we might differ slightly, which is fine. But if we engage a large company, we're saying that the starting inquiry would be, what would it mean for all of your activities across your offices, your supply chain, your whole vendor ecosystem, all of that to be regenerative? And that ultimately will land you in all the different bioregions and places where it has a footprint. So imagine a company on a regenerative journey that actually works in a way that we talked about Bill Reed might work recently, where you're trying to build regenerative capacity through that process. So imagine a large company actually having all of its employees begin to be on a regenerative journey, everybody they're touching and connecting with all across their whole footprint. And such a company might realize, it might make a lot more sense to be much more bioregional and have, highly localized circular economy processes, much more place-based forms of manufacturing. But there might still be some things. Iron's not that prevalent. In most bioregions, it's probably a good idea to trade a bit of iron rather than extracting it in a way that's destructive in a certain region. So instead of an economy of scale or, comparative advantage, what if it's about regenerative advantage? Certain materials and processes happen in certain ways to minimize any negative impact, and most bioregions don't have to even address that.
I'm that's with you. I mean, basically the work that I did with Ecovare in 2013, 14, 15, using Mallorca as an example, and the beauty was that Tom Dorman, the long-range innovation manager of Ecovare, was entirely in the spirit of, let's just try to do it in order to learn from it, not in order to necessarily succeed. We were basically asking the questions, could we use waste streams on Mallorca to produce all the detergents and cleaning products that the hotel industry needs on Mallorca, using a multinational, well-established ecological detergent company like Ecovare as a knowledge partner that would then actually create, and we did to some extent just that little project, despite the fact that eventually it stopped being funded. Our process was engaging the local chemical industry, the local bio innovation cluster, the local tourism cluster, in a kind of thinking about mapping the resource flows on the island and experimenting with what you can do with biofermentation of orange and olive, orange peel, or the waste products of olive presses. And while the project hasn't continued, the way of questioning we brought to the island has landed within these clusters of businesses that are now asking those questions. And so it is actually still living on. And that notion that we had, that it was on the one hand a complete innovation in product design based on a circular biomaterials economy, and how would we do that, but also an innovation in business model design, how a multinational, more as a knowledge and capacity holder, can partner with regional businesses to form these kind of what Ethan Rowland would call regenerative enterprise ecologies that actually help a flourishing regional regenerative economy to happen, and where increasingly the multinational becomes a network that facilitates what is still needs to be traded or needs to be exchanged, whether it's ideas, innovation, and knowledge, or whether it's the core elements that you can't produce locally. That's where I think a lot of the large corporates could reinvent themselves into these enabling networks of
Mm.
regionalization in my mind. So we're not
Beautiful.
at all like, because you said where we might differ. I don't think we differ at all. I've been working with this
Beautiful,
for years.
beautiful.
Yeah.
We we have woven together that strand. That's beautiful. And I would also just say, the planet is alive. These living systems, this immense biological diversity, the vast biogeochemical cycles, hydrological cycles, the planet is still fundamentally alive. And we've learned that in many ecosystems, not all, but in many, that if you simply remove some of the key pressures, make a few key interventions, maybe a few key plantings here and there, a few check up erosion over there, it can come back so quickly. You know, within,
you wouldn't
Bill
believe
Reed
the amount of
quotes,
dolphins jumping in the Bay of Palma.
right,
You can
right,
see them on my balcony. You only
exactly.
have to stop the marine traffic and they come back.
Stop the pressure. Bill Reed talks about 18 months, you know, as sort of a common baseline, that many ecosystems, they won't be restored, but they can move from a terrible kind of helix of degeneration into moving towards being able to self-regenerate and be on that adaptive spiral of increasing diversity and rebuilding itself. So the planet knows how to do this. It has that capacity. There are still roughly 400 million indigenous people that actually are stewards for vastly, you know, greater share of biological diversity than that number, and a very, very large piece of the planet. So there's this kind of green indigenous heart of the world that is waiting for us to remove the extractive infrastructure from edges where it's been pushed out to, and that green heart will move into the rest of the world.
I
And
love,
that is
yeah.
happening.
No, I love
and
that.
and
Yeah, continue. Sorry.
and you know, and underneath all this, you know, as we think about how do we actually regenerate, we have all of this that's still vibrant and thriving that we just need to connect to and listen and support, remove those key pressures. And so there's this mycelium of regeneration, the fungal root network, that is unstoppable. I think it really has reached that stage, and it's weaving together the different networks, the NGOs, even businesses. They're learning to create ecosystems of transformation, right? They're moving beyond, you know, from ego to eco, as Otto Scharmer would say, you know, the moving to this unbelievably rich, networked, distributed mycelial revival of life. And those processes are happening. The innovation occurring, for instance, in technical digital systems. There's now a thing called a DO, a DHO, a digital decentralized holonic organization. It's like a digital model of how life happens. And so we could literally switch on a regenerative set of financial flows almost overnight in a way that would actually mirror this mycelial interconnection. But we can't just do that. We've got to nurture the soil. We've got to nurture the stories and the narratives. And so that we're all really excited to actually, you know, turn off the petro, turn up the regenerative, and do that in an agreed upon, hopefully 10-year, 5-year, I think 10-year more realistic time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a lovely
Yeah.
thing to come back to. That basically, often people say, "How can you be so audaciously positive and about this vision of diverse regenerative cultures everywhere around the world?" And really, it's when you align with life, then you have the biggest ally possible, which is life itself. And it's
Exactly.
and yeah, there is so much still to be learned from those who have been stewarding the last pockets of healthy expression of life, creating conditions conducive to life. That it's this beautiful synthesis, not a going back to some kind of over idealized indigenous past, but that's why I like the word re-indigenization, which we can't, which we kind of Wetiko infested white people need the guidance of indigenous knowledge to do this well, but we can re-indigenize, all of us. And also so many of the indigenous nations have also been transformed and co-opted and affected by the insidious development agenda and industrial growth society. So they're not as pure and perfect as sometimes gets portrayed. So it's
Exactly.
co-learning, but the ally is really life itself, like all of us as expressions of life.
Exactly, a world of many worlds, a world of many different epistemologies, ontologies, ways of being, ways of seeing, that don't all have to be made compatible and interconnected. They can be respectfully learning and doing diplomacy, while having this deep differentiation of cultures and places. There's a beautiful called low tech, LO-TEK. In other words, kind of traditional ecological knowledge. And it's about traditional stewardship of landscapes in 20 different countries around the world. Beautiful book by Julia Watson. And so she's a landscape architect at Harvard and spent years.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Is that a recent book or?
Yes, a month ago.
Okay.
Extraordinary woman I just met in New York.
Did you say Julia Roberts, like the actor?
Julia Watson. Julia Watson.
So sorry.
Yeah, just had a wonderful meeting work from her base at both Harvard and Columbia. She's done field work for many, many years in 20 countries, looking at vivid current expressions of traditional ways of seeing and working with the landscape. And these are adaptive. They're not fixed in time. These have been continuously evolving. There's been learning from neighboring cultures and communities, adaptations, and so already now including certain modern materials and technologies, but all from local cultures still carrying deep adaptation to place, centuries of, and millennia in some cases, of deep co-creation with the landscape. Wonderful. And she argues, as a landscape architect, this is cutting edge. The depth of that way of knowing and working with landscape is incomparable with a technical intervention like you put in a bioswale here, a retention pond there. It's so deep because it's getting at this question of being human in a more than human world.
Wonderful. Thank you
well,
so
wonderful.
much for this conversation. Let me just stop the recording here.